Welcome to the deep dive. You know, we often hear about these foundational books that supposedly shape the world. Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, definitely one of those.
Absolutely. Big reputation.
But I think beyond just the history lesson, there's a surprising amount of really, well, practical stuff tucked away in there. Ideas that can actually help you understand how the economy works in your own life, your job, prices, all that.
That's spot on. I mean, it was published way back in 1776. Feels like ages ago, right?
Yeah, ancient history.
Mm. But The Wealth of Nations is fundamentally about, well, how societies get prosperous. Smith was a really keen observer. He looked at everything, workshops, history, human nature.
Right.
So our goal today really is to pull out those insights that still ring true, the ones that can give you maybe a fresh perspective on the whole economic picture.
Exactly. Forget the dry academic lecture stuff. We're kind of on a mission here to find those aha moments, like an economic survival guide hidden in this old book. We want you to walk away feeling a bit clearer about why things work the way they do.
And the core questions are still so relevant for everyone. How is wealth actually created? What's my role, the individual's role in this bigger economic machine? These are things we all bump up against.
Okay, so let's jump in. One of the first really big ideas Smith tackles is the power of the division of labor. He basically says that when individuals specialize, they get better at their specific job, more gets done overall, and, well, even knowledge increases because of it. What's that actually mean, though, day to day?
Well, think about almost any workplace you know, or even just different industries.
Yeah.
People specialize, right?
Sure. Marketing, sales, engineering.
Exactly. Instead of one person trying to juggle everything, you have folks focusing. And
Yeah.
that focus lets them get really good, really efficient. Quality goes up, output goes up. It's like a chef who only does pastries versus one trying to cook everything. The pastry specialist will probably be amazing.
Right. Smith had this great contrast, didn't he, between like a country carpenter.
Yeah, the guy who has to do everything, build the house, make the furniture, fix
Yeah.
cartwheels,
Yeah.
all sorts of woodwork.
Compared to how?
Compared to a town where you've got specialists. A joiner for connecting wood, a cabinet maker for furniture, a wheelwright just for wheels. Each one gets super skilled and fast in their lane.
And together they produce way more and probably better stuff.
Way more. And Smith's key insight was why this happens. It's because everyone feels certain they can trade what they make. They know they can exchange their surplus wheels or cabinets for food, clothes, everything else they need. That certainty encourages specialization. It fuels the whole system for you.
Which leads right into the next big piece, markets and exchange. I mean, this awesome division of labor is kind of pointless if you can't then trade your specialized thing.
Precisely. If you're a brilliant programmer but can't trade your code for groceries,
Uh-huh.
well, you're stuck.
You'll starve, basically.
Smith really highlighted how limited markets hold back specialization. He gave this example of a nail maker up in the Scotland Islands, a really sparsely populated area back then.
Okay.
This person could maybe make thousands of nails a day. But in a tiny, isolated village, who's buying all those nails?
Right, there's just not enough demand.
Exactly. Smith figured it would be impossible to sell even one day's work over a whole year in that situation. So for you, this shows how the size of the market, how connected it is, directly shapes the opportunities you have to specialize and the stuff that's available to buy.
It's like trying to open a niche bookstore in a tiny town that doesn't read much. Your specialization is limited by the market around you.
Perfect analogy. And that's where transportation becomes crucial. Smith pointed out that the first big improvements in industry happened where water transport opened up a whole world as a market, rivers, seas.
Ah, so ships could carry goods much further, reach more customers.
Exactly, which allowed for more specialization back in those areas. And think about today, the internet is like the ultimate water carriage, isn't it?
Totally. It connects buyers and sellers globally,
Right.
expands the market for almost anything.
Fueling even more specialization than Smith probably ever imagined.
Okay, so specialized trade in markets. Got it. But how do we figure out what something's actually worth? This is where Smith gets really interesting, and it might make you look at price tags a bit differently. He argued the real measure of value isn't money, it's labor.
Yeah, this is fundamental. He said that equal amounts of labor, anytime, anywhere, have the same value to the laborer. Think about the effort you put into an hour of work,
Okay.
whether it's physical work, mental work.
Yeah.
That hour of your time, your energy, your exertion, that has a constant value to you.
Right. The actual cash I get paid might change based on my job or the economy?
Exactly. That's the nominal price, the money price.
Yeah.
But the effort you put in, the sacrifice of your leisure, that's the real price.
Mm-hmm.
The cost in labor terms, money just helps us exchange that labor. But its own value can wobble.
So when I see a price, Smith would say, think about the actual human effort that went into making it, from raw material to finished product.
Basically, yes. While we pay with money, understanding that underlying labor gives you a sense of the true cost, the true value. It might make you appreciate, say, a handmade chair versus a factory-made one in a new way.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, looking at those actual shop prices, the nominal price, what are the ingredients of that number you see? Smith breaks it down.
He boils it down to three core components for pretty much everything: wages, profit, and rent.
Wages, profit, rent. Okay.
Wages are what the workers get paid. Profit is the return for the person who risked their capital, the business owner. And rent is the payment for using land or natural resources. Smith said these three are the original sources of all income and all exchangeable value.
So when you buy something, part of your money goes to the workers, part to the business's profit, and maybe part for the land or resources used.
Think about a cup of coffee. Part of what you pay covers the wages of the coffee bean pickers, the roasters, the barista.
Right.
Another chunk is the profit for the coffee shop owner. And another bit might be the rent for the land the beans grew on or the shop space itself.
Makes sense.
And Smith knew these aren't always perfectly separate boxes. If you're a freelancer, for example, your income is kind of both a wage for your work and a profit on your little business.
Okay.
But fundamentally, he argued, every price you pay can be traced back to those three things: wages, profit, rent.
So those are the underlying costs, the natural price components. But the price I actually pay in the shop can fluctuate, right?
Right.
That's where market price comes in.
Exactly. The natural price is like the baseline cost, what it really costs to bring that coffee to market, covering those wages, profit, and rent at their sort of average or natural rates.
Okay.
But the market price is what you actually fork over. And that can bounce around based on supply and demand. How many people suddenly want coffee versus how much the shop has ready to sell? Smith called this effectual demand, the demand from people who are actually willing and able to pay that natural price.
So if there's a sudden heat wave and nobody wants hot coffee, the market price might dip below the actual cost to make it just to sell it.
Precisely. Or if a new cafe opens and suddenly competition increases, prices might drop as they fight for your business.
And the opposite if a celebrity tweets about loving that specific coffee shop.
Demand spikes, and the market price could shoot way above the natural price, at least temporarily. Smith noticed some goods, like maybe basic linen cloths, had more stable prices because production could adjust fairly easily.
Right.
But things like corn or agricultural goods in general, their market price could swing wildly because harvests depend on weather, which is unpredictable. Even if demand stays the same, a bad harvest means less supply, higher prices for you.
Yeah, you see that with fruit and veg prices all the time, depending on the season or weather.
Exactly what he was describing.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. What about the relationship between bosses and workers, employers and employees? That impacts most of us directly. Smith talked about workers getting together like early unions, I guess.
He did. He observed that workmen, as he called them, often formed combinations to try and raise their wages. They'd argue about, the rising cost of living or point to the big profits their masters were making.
Sounds familiar.
And he noted these worker combinations were often loud, sometimes even resorting to violence or threats. They were always abundantly heard of, he said.
But he also saw a power imbalance, right?
Definitely. He pointed out that employers, the masters, also form their own combinations, often quietly, to keep wages down or resist increases. And because they generally had more money and resources, they could usually hold out longer in a dispute.
So the workers' efforts often didn't succeed.
Smith suggested that often these tumultuous combinations ended badly for the workers, sometimes with leaders being punished. It gives you a pretty stark historical view of the difficulties workers faced, trying to bargain collectively. He also mentioned that wages back then were often quite low, even if grain prices weren't that different, suggesting cost of living wasn't the only driver.
So beyond these combinations, what else did Smith see influencing wages? What makes your paycheck bigger or smaller?
Well, a huge factor is just the demand for labor. Simple supply and demand again. When the economy's booming, businesses need more people, they compete for workers, and wages tend to rise.
Makes sense.
Conversely, in a slump, fewer jobs, less demand for workers, wages might stagnate or fall. Smith put it clearly. Demand for labor goes up in times of plenty, down in times of scarcity, and the money price of labor follows. You see this cycle in the job market all the time.
What about the type of job itself?
Absolutely. Smith noted that jobs that are inherently unpleasant, dangerous, dirty, or maybe insecure often have to pay more to attract people.
Like a hazard pay kind of idea?
Sort of, yeah. Compensation for the downsides. Think about coal mining, he mentions that, or maybe construction work in bad weather, emergency responders. The higher wage reflects the hardship or risk involved. He said when you combine things like irregular work with hardship and dirtiness, it can push the wages for common labor above even skilled artisans sometimes. It's a premium for putting up with the tough stuff.
Interesting.
He even had this observation about risky ventures, like smuggling back then. The hope of huge profits attracts so many people that the actual average return ends up being pretty low because of the intense competition.
Bit of a warning for you about chasing quick, risky money without checking out the competition.
Good point. Now, Smith saw these wage differences as partly natural, but he was really critical of how government policies, especially in Europe then, created even bigger, often unfair inequalities. What kind of things was he talking about? Things that might still echo today for you?
He really went after things like strict apprenticeship laws and the rules set by guilds or corporations, basically, trade associations.
How did they cause inequality? Well, they often made it really hard and expensive to enter a trade. You might need a long, unpaid apprenticeship or pay high fees to the guild. This restricted the number of people who could become, say, a master weaver or a silversmith.
Limiting the supply of workers in that field.
Exactly. Which kept wages and profits artificially high for those already in the club. He gave an example of a coachmaker maybe being forced by guild rules to buy wheels only from the official wheelwrights guild, even if they could make them cheaper themselves or buy them elsewhere.
So less competition, higher prices for you, the consumer, and higher profits for the protected group.
That was his argument. He thought the public lost out because the work came to market more expensively. He saw these corporation laws as tools specifically designed by restraining that free competition, which would naturally lower prices and profits. He even saw this feeding into tension between towns, which had these protected trades, and the countryside focused on agriculture, which often lacked similar protections. You can kind of see parallels in modern debates about subsidies or tariffs for different industries.
And it wasn't just about jobs, right? He also talked about laws restricting where people could even move to find work, impacting your ability to relocate for opportunity.
Yes, the English poor laws and settlement laws were a big target for him. Basically, it was hard for a poor worker to legally move to a new parish, seeking work, unless they already had a settlement there, which might require owning property, a long apprenticeship in that specific place, things like that.
So if you were stuck in a village with no jobs, you couldn't easily pack up and move to a booming town where they needed workers.
It was much harder. These laws really hamper the mobility of labor, tying people to specific areas, preventing labor from flowing naturally to where it was most needed and could earn the most. It was inefficient for the whole economy. And interestingly, he speculated that maybe country laborers, because they had to turn their hand to many different tasks in farming, might actually develop a broader range of judgment and understanding than town mechanics who were hyper-specialized in one tiny operation. Food for thought about breadth versus depth of skills.
Let's talk about rent, what you pay to use property. Smith had a specific take on this, calling it a monopoly price. What did he mean by that?
He argued that the rent paid for using land isn't really determined by what the landlord invested or what they think is a fair return. Instead, it's determined by the maximum the tenant, like a farmer, can afford to pay after covering all their own production costs and making a standard profit for themselves.
So it's based on the user's ability to pay, driven by how productive the land is.
Exactly, and how much demand there is for what that land produces. If the land can grow valuable crops that are in high demand, the farmer can afford to pay more rent. If it's poor land or grows something nobody wants, it might command very little rent or none at all. The rent is essentially the surplus value the land generates because it's a limited resource, hence a kind of monopoly. So for you as a renter, the price reflects the location's desirability and what the market will bear.
Okay. Now, Smith also observed how the value of money itself, specifically gold and silver, could change dramatically over long periods. This relates to inflation, which definitely affects you. He used the discovery of America as a key example.
Right. The huge influx of silver and gold from the mines in the Americas into Europe over the 16th and 17th centuries dramatically increased the supply of precious metals.
And like any other commodity, more supply means.
Lower value relative to other things. Smith showed how the price of grain, like wheat measured in silver, had risen significantly over centuries. It took more silver to buy the same amount of wheat. This was long-term inflation driven by the increased money supply. It's a classic historical illustration of how the purchasing power of money isn't fixed, something very relevant for you thinking about saving or inflation today.
A good reminder. Now, thinking about prices, again, you mentioned wages and profits. Smith made a point that high profits tend to raise prices more than high wages do. That seems counterintuitive.
It does at first glance,
Uh-huh.
but his reasoning was about compounding. Think about making, say, a linen shirt. It goes through stages: growing flax, spinning yarn, weaving cloth, sewing the shirt. At each stage, there are wages paid and profits taken by the business owner.
Right.
If wages go up at each stage, those increases just add together in the final price. But if the rate of profit goes up, say from 10% to 15% at each stage, that increase gets applied to the accumulating cost from the previous stages. It compounds geometrically.
Ah, so the profit percentage is applied to a growing base cost at each step.
Exactly. So a rise in the profit rate across the board has a much larger multiplicative effect on the final price than a similar rise in wages just adding up. For you, the consumer, it suggests reining in excessive profit margins might be as important, or even more so, for controlling prices than just focusing on wages.
That's a really sharp observation. Okay, let's turn to money and banking, crucial for how you manage your finances. Smith saw money as vital, obviously, but also had some cautions.
He saw money, especially gold and silver coin, as the great wheel of circulation, essential for trade. But he also pointed out that maintaining that stock of precious metal was a cost to society.
How so?
Because that gold and silver, and the labor used to mine and mint it, could have been used for other productive things: tools, buildings, consumer goods. Keeping it locked up as just currency was like deducting it from the nation's active capital,
Like dead money, almost.
in a way. And this led him to discuss paper money issued by banks. He saw the potential benefit replacing expensive gold with cheap paper could free up capital, but he was also very aware of the risks.
Like banks printing too much.
Exactly. He warned strongly against banks over-issuing paper notes not backed by sufficient gold or silver reserves. He mentioned the Bank of England having problems, being forced to constantly coin gold because too much paper kept coming back to be exchanged. He also told a story of a new bank in Scotland that failed spectacularly because it made too many risky loans imprudent lending.
So, lessons about financial bubbles and bank runs, even back then.
Absolutely. He stressed the need for prudent banking. He also discussed regulations, like prohibiting very small denomination banknotes, arguing they often circulated among poorer people who were least able to judge a bank's soundness or absorb a loss if it failed. He called the issuers of such notes beggarly bankers.
Protecting the vulnerable.
And he noted that requiring banks to pay their notes immediately in gold or silver on demand was a key safety measure. He briefly touched on the Bank of Amsterdam and its bank money, though he seemed skeptical about the common explanations for its stability. Fundamentally, he argued, even if paper money gets devalued, the real value of gold and silver depends on the difficulty of mining them. Prudent regulation, like restricting small notes and ensuring convertibility, enhance public safety and banking principles that still inform banking regulation affecting you today.
What about how capital itself gets used? Smith categorized different ways businesses employ their funds.
He outlined 4 main ways capital gets employed. First, procuring raw produce from the earth: farming, mining, fishing. Second, manufacturing or processing that raw produce. Third, transporting goods from where they are abundant to where they are needed. And fourth, retailing or dividing goods into smaller portions for consumers.
So, primary production, manufacturing, transport, and retail.
Basically, yes. And he argued that capital employed in the home trade, producing and selling goods within your own country, generally supports more domestic jobs and productive activity than capital used in foreign trade.
Why is that?
Because with home trade, both the buying and selling happen locally, often replacing 2 distinct foreign capitals. Foreign trade is still beneficial, he thought, especially importing raw materials for domestic manufacturing, but he felt the carrying trade, just transporting goods between other foreign countries, was the least beneficial for supporting your own country's labor. It's about where the economic activity is generated and sustained.
Interesting perspective on prioritizing domestic investment. What did he see as the natural way for wealth and opulence to grow in a society?
He emphasized that the foundation of commerce in any civilized society is the exchange between the town and the country.
The city dwellers and the farmers?
Exactly. Towns need food and raw materials from the country. The country needs manufactured goods and services from the town. This constant exchange, driven by the division of labor between them, is mutually beneficial and drives overall prosperity.
And where did he think people naturally prefer to invest first?
In land, agriculture. Because, he argued, it offers the greatest sense of security and control. You can physically oversee your investment. Manufacturing, and especially foreign trade, seems riskier, more uncertain. So the natural inclination, if left alone, would be to invest in improving agriculture first, then manufacturing, then foreign trade.
But that natural order got distorted in Europe, didn't it? Especially after the Roman Empire fell.
Yes, he argued that the collapse of Roman order, the rise of feudalism, and various policies actively discouraged agriculture for centuries. Things like restrictions on land ownership, primogeniture entails, taxes that fell heavily on farmers, and prohibitions on exporting grain or even moving it freely within the country all hindered agricultural investment and improvement.
While agriculture was held back, towns started to gain ground.
Right. Towns, often through royal charters granting them privileges, gradually gained more liberty and independence than the rural population, who were often tied to feudal lords. Towns became centers of manufacturing and trade.
And how did they grow?
By trading their manufactured goods, maybe finer cloth, metalwork with the countryside for large amounts of food and raw materials, this exchange allowed them to thrive. He points to places like Leeds, Halifax, Sheffield, Birmingham, and England as examples of towns that grew organically from manufacturing, initially serving the surrounding agricultural areas.
This leads into his critique of the mercantile system, right? The dominant economic thinking of his time. What was that all about?
The core idea of mercantilism was that a nation's wealth was measured by its stockpile of gold and silver. So the goal of policy was to export as much as possible and import as little as possible to achieve a favorable balance of trade, meaning more gold coming in than going out.
So sell lots, buy little, keep the gold.
Pretty much. And this led governments to implement all sorts of policies, giving drawbacks, refunding duties on imported materials if the final product was exported, paying bounties, subsidies, to encourage exports of certain goods, and imposing high tariffs or outright bans on imports of goods that could be produced domestically.
Protectionism, giving local industries a monopoly in the home market.
Exactly. Smith was deeply critical of this. He argued these restraints forced a country's capital and labor into channels they wouldn't naturally choose, often into less productive industries, simply to secure that domestic monopoly.
He famously argued that individuals pursuing their own self-interest often do more good for society than those consciously trying to promote the public good, right? The invisible hand idea.
Yes, that underlying principle is key. While the exact quote about the butcher, brewer, and baker isn't in these specific excerpts we're focusing on, the sentiment permeates his critique of intervention. He believed individuals, seeking the best return for their own capital and labor, would naturally direct resources towards the most efficient and productive uses, benefiting society as a whole more effectively than government planners trying to dictate trade.
But he wasn't totally against all regulation. What about something like the Act of Navigation in England?
It's a famous exception he makes. The Navigation Acts restricted colonial trade largely to English ships and ports. Smith acknowledged this likely harmed pure economic opulence by limiting competition and raising freight costs. However, he famously concluded that defense, however, is of much more importance than opulence. Since the acts promoted Britain's naval strength, which was crucial for national security, he saw them as perhaps the wisest of England's commercial regulations, despite their economic downsides.
So national security could sometimes trump pure free trade, in his view. What about retaliating against other countries' trade restrictions?
He saw a potential role for retaliatory tariffs, imposing duties on goods from a country that restricts your exports, if there's a good chance it will make the other country remove their restrictions. But he cautioned it was a tricky judgment call, and if retaliation wasn't likely to work, it just added another burden on your own consumers. He also briefly noted the economic disruption caused by suddenly demobilizing large numbers of soldiers and sailors after a war, throwing many skilled people out of work simultaneously.
Let's talk about colonies, a huge part of the world economy then. How did Smith view the relationship between mother countries like Britain and the colonies in America?
Primarily through the lens of the mercantile system's exclusive trade, mother countries sought to monopolize the trade of their colonies.
How did that work?
They forced colonies to sell certain valuable enumerated commodities like sugar, tobacco, cotton, only to the mother country. and they often required colonies to buy manufactured goods only from the mother country, even if they'd get them cheaper elsewhere.
So a guaranteed market for the mother country's exports and cheap raw materials from the colonies. Sounds good for the mother country.
Yes, but Smith argued it was detrimental to the colonies, restricting their growth and forcing them into less advantageous trade. It also harmed other European nations excluded from this trade. He saw it as artificially diverting capital towards the colony trade, which he didn't think was inherently the most productive use. He mentioned the complexities of the sugar trade, duties and refining, and the role of slavery on the plantations, acknowledging its economic function while famously condemning the overall colonial policy of Europe towards America as rooted in folly and injustice.
Despite the flaws in policy, did Europe benefit overall from discovering America?
Oh, definitely. He acknowledged huge advantages. Europeans gained access to a vast range of new goods, increasing their enjoyments. More importantly, the new markets and resources stimulated European industry enormously. It vastly increased the mass of commodities annually thrown into the great circle of European commerce.
But he remained deeply critical of monopolies created by these colonial systems and other policies.
Absolutely. He saw monopolies as inherently harmful, raising prices and reducing output for the benefit of a few merchants or manufacturers at the expense of the public. He had some harsh words for the mean rapacity and monopolizing spirit of merchants who sought these advantages. He felt the true measure of a nation's prosperity wasn't the balance of trade, gold flows, but the balance of annual produce and consumption, how much useful stuff the country actually makes and consumes each year.
What about bounties, subsidies to encourage exports? He mentioned them earlier.
He was generally against them too. Take the corn bounty in Britain, designed to encourage grain exports. Smith argued it imposed two taxes on the people. First, the direct tax to pay the bounty, and second, the artificially higher price of corn in the whole market because the bounty encouraged selling it abroad. He believed bounties forced trade into less naturally advantageous channels, ultimately wasting resources.
He also analyzed specific trade deals, like the Methuen Treaty between Britain and Portugal.
Yes, that treaty lowered British duties on Portuguese wine in exchange for Portugal lowering duties on English woolen cloth. Smith thought Portugal got the better deal, as wine was a unique product while England faced competition in cloth markets. The treaty was popular in Britain partly because it was thought to secure the flow of gold from Brazil, a Portuguese colony, to England via Portugal, fitting the mercantile obsession with gold.
He also touched on coinage itself, right?
Briefly, yes.
Yeah.
He noted that if the government covers the cost of minting coins, free coinage, the value of coined money can't really rise much above the value of the equivalent weight of uncoined metal, bullion. He also discussed how worn-out coinage could affect the market price of bullion.
And he used the East India Company as a prime example of a bad monopoly.
Yes, the English East India Company held an exclusive charter for trade with India and the East. Smith saw it as a prime example of how such monopolies enrich the company's officials and shareholders, but oppress the local populations they govern and harm the home country by restricting trade and raising prices. He argued these exclusive companies were ultimately detrimental to the nation that created them.
Another interesting distinction Smith made was between productive and unproductive labor. What was that about?
This is a bit controversial today, but his idea was that productive labor was work that resulted in a tangible, vendable commodity, something you could sell. Think of artisans, manufacturers, merchants, whose work fixes itself in goods.
So making a chair, weaving cloth.
Exactly. Unproductive labor, in his view, was labor whose services perished in the instant of their performance, like servants, government officials, lawyers, doctors, actors, musicians. Their labor is valuable, he stressed, but it doesn't directly create a physical product that adds to the nation's stock of goods. It's more about how labor contributes to accumulating capital versus immediate consumption.
Okay. And finally, what did he see as the essential duties of government, the sovereign?
He outlined three main duties. First, protecting society from external threats defense. He noted this becomes more expensive as society advances, often requiring a professional standing army instead of just a militia. Second, establishing and maintaining an exact administration of justice, protecting property rights and enforcing contracts. He controversially suggested that civil government arises partly to defend the property of the rich against the poor, as property accumulation inevitably leads to inequality and potential conflict.
And the third duty?
Third, erecting and maintaining certain public works and institutions that are beneficial to society, but might not be profitable for individuals or small groups to undertake. Things like roads, bridges, canals, harbors, maybe basic education. He discussed funding these through tolls or taxes, but cautioned against tolls becoming so high they obstruct commerce, especially on essential routes like canals.
Mm.
He also briefly mentioned regulated companies for foreign trade, different from exclusive monopolies like the East India Cap, noting they were generally declining.
Wow, okay. That's a lot ground covered, even just scratching the surface of this massive book. Reflecting on all this, it's amazing how much of it still feels relevant, isn't it? The practicality of these ideas from 1776.
It really is. I think the key takeaway for you, the listener, is how understanding these fundamental principles, division of labor, markets, value, the components of price, the impact of policy, empowers you. It helps you make more informed decisions in your own economic life, whether as an employee, a consumer, an investor, or just a citizen evaluating economic policies.
Yeah, knowing why things might be priced the way they are, or why certain jobs pay more, or how regulations can affect competition. It gives you a framework.
Exactly. It helps you see the forces at play in your workplace, in the news, in the global economy. It encourages critical thinking about how wealth is created and distributed.
So, as you go about your week, maybe think about how the division of labor plays out in your job or companies you interact with. Notice the market forces affecting prices you pay. Consider the real labor value behind the goods you buy.
And perhaps mull over this. Considering these principles, Smith laid out specialization, free exchange, the potential distortions of policy. What do you think are the most significant barriers to economic progress and individual opportunity in the world today? Something to ponder.
Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the wealth of nations. We'll catch you next time.